And now to help us navigate the challenges retail faces, I am joined by Alexis Ohanian, co-founder of the social media platform Reddit. He now invests in early-stage startups through his investment firm, Initialized Capital, which has grown success stories like grocery delivery service Instacart and online real estate marketplace Open Door. And Focus Brands president Kat Cole, you know Focus from their more than 6,000 franchise locations, a good portion of which are run by small business owner. They include mall favorites like Cinnabon, Carvel Ice Cream, and Jamba Juice, to name a few. Kat, thank you for joining us. I want to start with you. As I just mentioned, many of your franchises are in malls, and some are reopening, some are not. How should they navigate this change? What advice are you giving them?
You know, for those based in malls, there are three pieces of advice. First is safety and survival. So take care of yourself, take care of your people, manage your cash. Second is something that your piece just covered with other brick and mortar businesses, with getting as much line of sight to rent obligations as possible. One of the scariest things for brick and mortar operators right now, outside of no line of sight to when sales will come back, is their rent obligations and not having strong negotiations with their landlords to understand how much flexibility there is there, what they will owe for March and April when they were closed, and what their obligations are going to be as their sales are potentially cut in half. So we are working with our franchisees to steward them through those negotiations and encourage them to understand their options. So I encourage any small business owner to really focus there. We're telling people, pay a little, pay what you can, be in conversation with your landlords. And let's keep in mind, there's not a long line of people waiting behind you to take your space. So you do have some leverage. And then third is think about innovation. We are already on every third-party delivery platform. We have franchisees launching food trucks. If the business doesn't come to you, you need to go to the business. And if there's any way to do that affordably, we're helping them navigate those plans.
Alexis, innovating is also connected to pivoting, and we hear that over and over these days. We'll just pivot. But for a lot of the businesses that you advise, they're still teeny weeny. They've barely gotten started. Can they pivot before they've even hit their stride?
Yeah, you know, one of the advantages to being the earliest investors in a startup is that when we do invest, you know, we're really just investing in a founder or two. And so the team is small. The burn rate, that is the amount of money they're spending, is still really limited. And so the prospect of having your trajectories just massively altered because of COVID-19 is daunting. But they have the advantage of runway. They have the advantage of being able to adapt. And because so many of these businesses are at their core software based, they're finding ways to thrive. Even a sneaker company, we backed Adams, took their manufacturing facilities in Korea and pivoted them into producing masks with their copper linings, sold 60,000 masks in the first week as part of a give one, get one program. And I think we're seeing this resourcefulness time and time again in the portfolio, but also across the country. And I just want to underscore what Kat said earlier, which is that small to medium businesses are really the backbone of this economy, and they are the ones who we need to get back and up and running as soon as possible.
Well, these viewers certainly agree. We've got small businesses at home watching, and quite a few wrote to us. I want to start with a video question from a viewer, Zach. Take a look.
Hi, my name is Zachary Sass, and I'm an executive chef. I went to GoDaddy.com and created my business, ChefZachSass.com, an online video virtual cooking class with me. Right now, my services are on a donation basis due to hard times. My question to you would be, what would be the best way to associate a cost for my service after COVID-19 has gone? Thank you.
Kat, what do you think?
There are so many options. As Alexis said, this founder started his business in the virtual world. And so he's not in a position to have to pivot a physical brick and mortar. So the sky's the limit. A few options would be think about subscription services for your most loyal fans, the people who want to learn how to cook many different types of things. You can have recurring revenue or upfront revenue to provide value over time. So subscription is an option. Second is some people are still asking chefs, because it's one person coming into their home, to do in-home classes for a premium cost. Social distanced, of course, but that's always an option. And then third is to think about co-opetition. competition. I love partnering with services that others might say are your competition, but might be a way for you to get your brand message and out there and access consumers. So partner with a restaurant that might be closed half of the day because of what's going on, and you can do some social distance classes or be in even a better commercial kitchen to film your workshop. So think about other businesses that might also be impacted where you could benefit from each other's access to market.
Yeah, and
Alexis,
this reminded me. Well, I can't help myself.
Sorry,
there's actually an initialized company called Icaria, which saw this need from yoga instructors, all kinds of skilled practitioners who can't operate in-person classes. They launched a website that used the Zoom API and Google Calendar integration to allow them to book virtual classes. And this infrastructure is literally getting built now in the last few weeks, and we're seeing talented professionals find ways to take their skills like cooking and teach digital classes using this infrastructure that literally didn't exist a few weeks ago.
Kat, I want to go to a question from a business owner who doesn't want to be forgotten. Matt runs a completely B2B business. It's an office beverage dispenser company. And he writes, our business is totally B2B. How can we creatively market to customers during the time when everybody's shut down and keep them engaged and stay on top of mind while they're at home?
I love this question because you're asking about how do we stand out, but I always encourage small business owners who are asking for this type of advice to also be humble. Depending on your business, you might not be able to be top of mind for that business. Respect the fact that they might have furloughed or laid off employees. They're worried about rent. And depending on what you sell, if it's coffee machines or plates or office furniture, hard to say that you'll be top of mind. But there are ways that you can add value, and that is showing up in your community to provide services if you are able to do so. Talk to your customers, if they're already your customers, about what they need. No marketing approach of talking about your product is going to cut through the noise and the worry and the fear and the mountains of concerns right now. But being there to help in any way, even if it's, hey, as you think about reopening your office, could I come in with some of my team and help you with those reopening plans and help you think about how to reopen, if it's coffee machines, your cafes in your offices, maybe provide some of the social distancing stickers, because if there's one place people cluster around an office, it's the coffee machine. So think about ways you can add value that show you're a partner in the business versus trying to just stand out amidst a lot of environment of concern.
Alexis, our next question might be answered by your yoga instructors. This is from an acupuncturist in Colorado who's asking, her revenue has basically disappeared, but she still has rent to pay, and she understands that her landlord is a small business owner himself. How does she approach renegotiating those contracts when she knows he also has bills?
Yeah, well, you got a taste of the answer there from Kat, too, talking about doing it in a respectful way and trying to start a conversation knowing that a lot of people are in a bad situation right now. We actually have a company we backed last year called Withco, which a year ago we knew was going to be core infrastructure to help small to medium businesses thrive. We didn't know just how valuable they would be now during COVID. They're only in Charlotte right now, but right now they're giving 0% interest loans to 50 small businesses in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, because they want the relationship with these small businesses, and in particular to be able to give them the software to run their businesses more effectively and actually give them more authority to be able to, when we start to come back from this, to be able to in the future call in loans or at least get some of the value from the spaces they occupy. Like, the tragedy here is that yoga instructor has been providing so much value to the physical space that she operates in, but she gets none of it in the sense that she pays her rent every month. Her biggest expense is that overhead, and she doesn't accrue that value. And so in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, that neighborhood or that street or that section of town is much better off because her small business is thriving. And yet she doesn't get the value. And I think one of the big things that I hope emerges from this is a new way to think about that relationship, even just the financing, because that traditional rent check every month doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it properly values all of the quality and all of the increased value that a successful small business creates. And so I think we're going to see new financial tools come out of this. This doesn't help her right now. Withco will help lots of companies in Charlotte and eventually many more cities. But this is something I think we need to get more creative with. We need more solutions. We need more competitors, frankly, to companies like Withco that are coming up with better financing alternatives, because it's just silly. Like, that much overhead to see no value from it. It's not right, and it's not good for these small businesses or for the communities they serve.
Two things that
Kat,
she could do right away.
Yes.
Two things she could do right away is share what her monthly rent would do without revenue. Just show how quickly she would have to close her doors. That's how we're advising our franchisees. It does no one any good to get rent for April if you're closed for the rest of 2020 and beyond. So be a bit transparent with your financials, and then propose going to a percentage rent structure once you do open back up. And so if you win, they win. But if there's no revenue, whatever the percent is of zero, that's what you're paying the landlord. So those have tended to be helpful approaches for some of our small business owners.
Kat, Alexis, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your heart. I really appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.